What if the life you were living was only half the story? What if a single chance encounter could unravel a past so carefully hidden that it changed not only your future, but the very truth of who you are? For one waitress, a single sentence spoken in a moment of duress was about to unlock a legacy of secrets, sorrow, and ultimately, justice. This is a story about a simple silver locket, a desperate plea for answers, and a test of character so demanding it could either shatter a young woman's spirit or reveal the unbreakable strength within her. The rain fell in relentless sheets against the windows of the Greasy Spoon diner, each drop a tiny hammer against the thin glass. Inside, Alara moved through the narrow aisles with a practiced, weary grace. Each shift felt longer than the last, a marathon of refilling coffee, wiping down sticky tables, and forcing a smile she rarely felt. The scent of stale coffee and fried onions was the perfume of her life. Every dollar from her tip jar was a small victory, another drop in the cavernous bucket of her mother's medical bills. Her mother, her entire world, was fading in a small, second-floor apartment, tethered to machines that hummed a constant, terrifying rhythm of need. Alara felt that rhythm in her own bones. It was the beat of desperation. It was in this state of quiet despair that he walked in. He didn't belong. Even soaked and disheveled from the storm, his expensive wool coat dripped entitlement onto the worn linoleum. His face, etched with a permanent scowl, scanned the humble diner with disdain. This was Alistair Sterling, a man whose name was a headline, a titan of industry who moved markets with a whisper. But here, in the Greasy Spoon, he was just a grumpy, wet customer. He was impatient. His coffee wasn't hot enough. His toast was too brown. He drummed his fingers on the table, a sound that grated on Alara's already frayed nerves. Finally, after a perceived delay in receiving his check, his frustration boiled over. "Is it too much to ask for competent service in this city?" he boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent diner. Every customer froze, forks hovering mid-air. "I have places to be. I don't have time for this." He gestured dismissively, and the back of his hand caught the delicate silver chain around Alara's neck. The clasp on her locket, worn from years of opening and closing, gave way, clattered onto the table, popping open. Alistair Sterling fell silent. His eyes, which had been blazing with irritation, were now fixed on the tiny, faded photograph inside the silver heart. It was the face of a young woman with a radiant, sorrowful smile. He looked from the photo to Alara, his expression unreadable. "Where?" he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Did you get that?" Alara's heart pounded. She felt the eyes of every person in the diner on her. Her first instinct was to shrink away to apologize. But the locket, it was the one piece of her father she had. A man she never knew. A man her mother spoke of with a love so profound it was almost a ghost in their small apartment. A surge of protective instinct rose within her, silencing her fear. She met the billionaire's gaze, her own chin held high. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. She said it belonged to the only man she ever loved. The world seemed to stop. The clatter of cutlery, the hum of the refrigerator, the drumming of the rain. It all faded into a muffled roar. Alistair Sterling stared at her, his face ashen. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, staggering shock that seemed to shatter his composure. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a ghost. He saw an impossibility. And in that moment, for reasons Alara couldn't possibly comprehend, her entire life was irrevocably altered. Alistair Sterling did not move for a full minute. He simply stared, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and a grief he thought he had long since buried. Finally, he gestured to the empty booth across from him. His hand was trembling. "Sit," he commanded, though the word came out more like a plea. Alara hesitated, glancing toward her manager, who was watching from behind the counter with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. She couldn't just sit with a customer. But the look in this man's eyes was no longer that of an arrogant billionaire. It was the look of a man who had seen a phantom in broad daylight. She slid into the vinyl seat, her worn apron crinkling. He pushed the locket across the table toward her. "Your mother," he began, his voice raspy. "What is her name?" "Clara," Alara replied softly. "Clara Vance." Alistair closed his eyes, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The name meant nothing to him. And yet, the face in the locket, it was his sister, Lily, dead for 20 years. A sister whose memory was a locked room in the mansion of his heart. How could this stranger's mother possess a locket with Lily's photograph, claiming it came from a lost love? "I need you to come with me," he said abruptly, his decision made in an instant. The logic was insane, the impulse reckless, but the image of his sister's smile from inside that cheap piece of silver overrode everything. Alara recoiled. "Come with you? I don't even know you. I have to work." "My mother." "I will compensate you for your time," he interrupted, pulling out a sleek, black wallet. He placed 5 $100 bills on the table. "This is for your shift. There will be more. Much more." He paused, his gaze softening for the first time. "You mentioned your mother is ill. I can help with that, too. Whatever she needs. The best doctors, the best care. All of it." Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Alara's apprehension. The best care. Words she had only ever dreamed of. An end to the constant worry, the rationing of medicine, the fear of the next hospital bill. But it felt like a devil's bargain. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do all that for a stranger?" "Because you are not a stranger," Alistair said, his eyes again finding the locket she now clutched in her hand. "Not anymore. That locket. It connects you to a part of my past I thought was gone forever. I need to understand how. I need you to help me." He leaned forward, his voice dropping, filled with an intensity that was both frightening and compelling. "Please, help me find the truth." Alara looked at the money on the table, then at the hard, desperate face of the man before her. This was madness. But her mother's tired face flashed in her mind. The thought of her peaceful, pain-free sleep was a siren song Alara couldn't resist. With a deep breath that felt like a leap into a vast, unknown abyss, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll help you." The transition from the greasy spoon to Alistair Sterling's world was jarring. One moment, she was surrounded by the scent of frying bacon. The next, she was ascending in a silent, glass elevator to a penthouse that floated above the city like a ship in the clouds. The apartment was a monument to wealth and emptiness. Polished marble floors, minimalist furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking, impersonal vista. It was beautiful and cold, much like the man who owned it. Alistair led her to a vast, sterile study lined with books that looked as though they had never been opened. He had already made a call. A private nurse was on her way to Alara's apartment, and a specialist had been consulted. The speed and ease with which he wielded his power were dizzying. "We start here," he said, gesturing to a large mahogany desk. "My sister's name was Lillian Sterling. We called her Lily." He spoke the name as if it were a fragile piece of glass. "She passed away 2 decades ago. She was everything to me. After our parents died, she was all I had." He explained that Lily had grown withdrawn and melancholic in her final years. The family had attributed it to a deep-seated depression, but its origins were a mystery. She never spoke of a man, never brought anyone home. Yet here was Alara, with a locket that screamed of a secret love. "My mother never told me my father's name," Alara explained, her voice small in the cavernous room. "Only that he was a good man, a kind man. She said they were torn apart by circumstances they couldn't control. She gave me this locket before I was born, told me it would keep him close to my heart." The first twist in the puzzle came from an unexpected place. Alistair, driven by a new, frantic energy, had his staff retrieve boxes of his sister's old belongings from a climate-controlled storage unit. For hours, he and Alara sifted through dusty photo albums, old yearbooks, and forgotten trinkets. It was in a leather-bound diary from Lily's 21st year that they found the first clue. Tucked into the back pocket was a photograph. Not of a man, but of two young women, arms linked, laughing into the camera. One was a vibrant, joyful Lily Sterling. The other was a younger, healthier version of Alara's mother, Clara Vance. Alistair stared at the photo, his mind racing. They knew each other, he breathed. Lily and your mother were friends. This was the first true revelation, the first concrete link. Lily hadn't given the locket to a man. She had given it to her friend, Clara. But why? And who was the man Clara had fallen in love with? The mystery deepened. Alara felt a strange mix of hope and dread. She was getting closer to understanding her origins, but she was also stepping deeper into the painful history of this powerful, grieving man. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a detective in the archaeology of her own past, and the dig site was the fragile heart of Alistair Sterling. The discovery that their mothers were friends changed the dynamic between them. A tentative, fragile alliance formed in the sterile quiet of the penthouse. For Alistair, Alara was no longer just a puzzle. She was a living, breathing connection to a sister he had lost. For Alara, Alistair was no longer just a benefactor. He was the keeper of a history that was inexplicably tied to her own. But their burgeoning investigation was not to go unchallenged. For days into their search, a new figure entered the scene. Marcus Thorne, Alistair's cousin and the chief operating officer of Sterling Industries, arrived at the penthouse unannounced. He was sharp, impeccably dressed, and radiated a smooth, reptilian charisma. He had heard that Alistair had sequestered himself from the office, accompanied by a mysterious young woman. His arrival was framed as concern, but his eyes held a cold, calculating curiosity. Alistair, we were getting worried, Marcus said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he took in the scene. The boxes of old memorabilia, the scattered photos, and Alara, standing awkwardly by the desk. Working on a new project. Something personal, Marcus? Alistair replied, his tone guarded. This is Alara Vance. She is helping me with some family history. Marcus's gaze swept over Alara. A quick, dismissive appraisal that made her feel like an insect under a microscope. Vance? He feigned a moment of thought. I don't believe we have any Vances in the family tree. A pleasure to meet you, the words were polite, but the undertone was laced with suspicion. From that moment on, Marcus became a shadow. He began showing up at the penthouse with flimsy excuses. Papers that needed signing, market updates that couldn't wait. His true purpose was clear, to observe, to probe, and to undermine. You must be careful, Alistair, he'd say in a hushed, conspiratorial tone when he thought Alara was out of earshot. A girl from a diner? It's a classic story. She sees an opportunity. People will do anything for money. He directed his psychological warfare at Alara as well. He would ask her pointed questions about her life, her finances, her mother's illness, all under the guise of friendly interest. It must be quite a change for you, he remarked one afternoon, gesturing around the opulent living room. From slinging hash to this. A real Cinderella story. You just have to make sure the glass slipper fits. The insinuation was clear. She was an imposter, a fraud waiting to be exposed. Alara felt the weight of his suspicion like a physical pressure. He was planting seeds of doubt in Alistair's mind, making her feel like a con artist. The hope that had bloomed within her began to wither under his cynical gaze. Was she just a pawn in some rich family's forgotten drama? Was Alistair's generosity a temporary whim that would vanish as soon as Marcus's poison took root? She started to question everything, including herself. Her resilience, born of hardship, was being tested not by poverty, but by the insidious pressure of wealth and distrust. The tension in the penthouse grew thick enough to choke on. Marcus's presence was a constant, unnerving friction. Alistair, caught between his instinct to trust the girl who looked at him with honest, searching eyes and his cousin's pragmatic warnings, became more withdrawn. The investigation stalled. It was Alara who broke the stalemate. Fueled by a desperate need to prove Marcus wrong, and to prove to herself that she wasn't a fool, she went back to the boxes of Lily's belongings, this time with a singular focus. She wasn't looking for a man. She was looking for her mother. Late one night, long after Alistair had retired to his room, she found it. At the bottom of a chest filled with old university textbooks was a small, unassuming wooden box. It wasn't locked. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a stack of letters, tied with a blue ribbon. The handwriting on the first envelope was elegant and familiar. It was Lily's, but the letters were not addressed to her. They were addressed to a man named Daniel, and they were all signed, "Your devoted friend and confidant, Lily." Alara's hands trembled as she opened the first letter. It was not a love letter. It was a letter of encouragement, of shared secrets. Lily wrote of her friend Clara's overwhelming love for Daniel, of their secret meetings, of their dreams to build a life far from the stifling influence of the Sterling family. Clara, it turned out, was Lily's assistant. Daniel was a landscape architect who had been hired to work on the Sterling estate. They had fallen in love under Lily's nose, and she had become their secret keeper. But as she read on, the tone of the letters shifted. They grew more frantic, more desperate. Lily wrote of her father's discovery of the relationship and his furious disapproval. He would not have a Sterling-adjacent employee marrying a nobody. He had forbidden Daniel from the property and threatened Clara's job. The final letter was tear-stained. Lily described a terrible fight with her father. She wrote of a plan. Daniel was to leave the city for a short time to let things cool down. The family would give him a sum of money to help him get established elsewhere, and once he was settled, he would send for Clara. It was a painful, temporary separation, but it was their only hope. The locket, Lily wrote, was a gift from her to Clara, a placeholder for the man she loved, a promise of his return. Alara sat back, the letters clutched to her chest. This was it, the second major twist. Daniel. Her father's name was Daniel, and the Sterling family, Alistair's own father, had been the ones to drive him away. A wave of anger and sorrow washed over her. Alistair was not just the keeper of her history. His family was the source of her lifelong pain. She now held the proof. The question was, what would happen when she showed it to him? The revelation of the letters created a new, painful chasm between Alara and Alistair. When she showed him the correspondence, his face hardened with a familial shame. He saw his father's cold, class-obsessed pride laid bare, and he recognized it as the same force that had shaped his own life. The generosity he had shown Alara now felt like a hollow penance for a sin he hadn't known his family had committed. Marcus, of course, seized the opportunity. "So, a groundskeeper," he said with a contemptuous sneer during a tense meeting in the study. Her father was a gardener who knocked up an assistant and took a payout. "This is what you've turned your life upside down for, Alistair? A sordid little affair from 20 years ago? The girl is leveraging this for all it's worth." The accusation hung in the air, thick and venomous. Alara felt a hot flush of shame, not for her father's profession, but for the way Marcus used it as a weapon. This became her ultimate test. Marcus, believing he had the upper hand, decided to force the issue. One evening, he approached Alara alone. He placed a cashier's check on the marble countertop in the kitchen. The amount written on it was staggering, enough to solve all her mother's problems and secure their lives for years to come. "Take it," Marcus said, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. "You've done well. You found a story, you got my cousin's attention, and you've had a nice little vacation from your real life. But it's over. This story only brings pain and embarrassment to the Sterling name. Alistair is sentimental, but he'll see reason eventually. I'm offering you a clean break. Take the money, disappear, and go back to your life. No one gets hurt." It was the ultimate temptation. Everything she had ever wanted, everything she had worried and wept over, was right there on that piece of paper. The path of least resistance. The sensible choice. Her mother's face swam in her vision, her weak smile, her labored breathing. This check could end all of that. But then she thought of her father, Daniel, the gardener who had loved her mother. She thought of the tear-stained letters from Lily, a woman who had tried to help them. This wasn't just about money. It was about the truth. It was about a love story that had been deliberately and cruelly shattered. Taking this check would be a betrayal of their memory. It would be validating Marcus's belief that she, and people like her, were driven by nothing more than greed. She looked at the check, then back at Marcus's smug face. She pushed it back across the counter. "My father's story isn't for sale," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "My mother's love isn't a commodity, and my integrity isn't something you can buy." What neither of them knew was that Alistair, unable to rest, had come to the kitchen for a glass of water. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, listening to the entire exchange. He heard Marcus's cynical offer and Alara's quiet, powerful refusal. In that moment, every seed of doubt Marcus had planted in his mind was burned away. He saw Alara not as a threat or an opportunist, but as a young woman of immense character, a woman worthy of the truth. He saw a flicker of his sister's spirit in her, the same loyalty, the same fierce heart. He finally knew whose side he was on. The test had been for Alara, but it was Alistair who had received the answer. The dam of secrecy finally broke. Galvanized by Alara's integrity, Alistair threw the full weight of his resources into uncovering the final layer of the truth. He hired a discreet but relentless private investigator, a man who specialized in digging up the buried financial skeletons of the elite. "Find out what happened to Daniel," Alistair instructed. "His last name is unknown. Start with the payroll records for the estate 20 years ago. Find every payment, every transaction. I want to know where he went." While the investigator worked, Alistair and Alara retreated into a world of shared purpose. The tension between them dissolved, replaced by a profound, melancholic bond. He told her stories about Lily, about her laughter and her kindness, and Alara shared stories of her mother, of her resilience and her unwavering love for a man she had lost. They were two people, from opposite ends of society, united by a shared grief and a common history. The investigator's report came less than a week later. It arrived in a sealed manila envelope that felt impossibly heavy. Alistair opened it in his study, with Alara sitting across from him. The first page was a payroll ledger from 2 decades prior. There he was, Daniel Miller, a landscaper. The following pages detailed the severance payment. A wire transfer for $50,000, a significant sum at the time, was made from a Sterling family trust to an account Daniel had opened. So far, the story matched Lily's letters. But it was the last document that changed everything. It was a copy of a page from a secondary, private ledger kept by the family's old financial advisor, a man who had since passed away. This ledger detailed discretionary expenses. Alongside the official $50,000 payment to Daniel Miller was a second, smaller entry. A cash payment of $10,000 to a Mr. T for Miller mitigation, and beside it, a scribbled, cryptic note, leverage secured, subject neutralized. Alistair's blood ran cold. He knew immediately who Mr. T was, Marcus Thorne. Attached to the ledger was one final item, a scanned copy of a letter. The investigator had found it in the deceased advisor's personal effects, a confession sealed and marked to be opened only upon his death. The letter explained everything. Young Marcus Thorne, ambitious and eager to prove his worth to the Sterling patriarch, had been tasked with handling the Daniel problem. He saw an opportunity not just to follow orders, but to exceed them. The official payment was made, but Marcus, on his own initiative, used the extra $10,000 to orchestrate a far more sinister plan. He didn't just pay Daniel to leave. He framed him for embezzlement from a previous job, using fabricated evidence. He confronted Daniel not with a payout, but with a choice: disappear forever and take the money, or face prison and public ruin. Daniel, a simple man with no resources to fight a powerful family, took the deal and vanished, too ashamed and frightened to ever contact Clara again. This was the final, devastating twist. It wasn't Alistair's father whose cruelty had been absolute. It was Marcus. He had done it to curry favor, to eliminate a potential complication to the Sterling dynasty, and to secure his own ascent. He had single-handedly destroyed 3 lives: Daniel's, Clara's, and Lily's. Lily's subsequent spiral into depression was no longer a mystery. She had died of a broken heart, believing the man her best friend loved had simply abandoned her for money. Alistair looked at Alara, his face a mask of horror and fury. The entire tragedy, her fatherless life, her mother's sorrow, his own sister's death, could be laid at the feet of one man, his own cousin, the man who stood to inherit a portion of the empire Lily should have shared. The revelation was no longer just about the past. It was about a monstrous, present-day injustice that screamed for a reckoning. The confrontation was set for the next day, in the place where Marcus felt most powerful, the Sterling Industries boardroom. Alistair called an emergency meeting of the executive board, citing a critical issue regarding corporate succession and the integrity of the company's leadership. Marcus arrived, confident and composed, assuming Alistair had finally come to his senses and was ready to oust the waitress problem. He walked into the boardroom with a self-satisfied smile, which faltered only slightly when he saw Alara standing silently beside Alistair at the head of the long, polished table. "Alistair, what is the meaning of this?" Marcus began, addressing the room. "I trust this emergency is worth pulling us all away from our duties." Alistair didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Alara, giving her a small, determined nod. This was her moment, her story, her truth to reclaim. Alara stepped forward. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of 20 years of silence. "My father's name was Daniel Miller," she said, her eyes locked on Marcus. "He was a landscaper on your family's estate. He loved my mother, and she loved him." Marcus scoffed. "We've been over this. A charming, if pathetic, story. What is your point?" "My point," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength, "is that he didn't abandon her. He was forced away. He was threatened." "Threatened? By whom?" "My uncle was a hard man." "But not by your uncle," Alistair cut in, his voice like ice. He slid a folder across the table toward the board members. "By you, Marcus." Inside the folder were copies of the advisor's ledger and his confession letter. As the board members began to read, a stunned silence fell over the room. Marcus's face went from smug to pale to crimson with rage. "This is absurd. It's slander," he sputtered, looking wildly from the papers to Alistair. "You're taking the word of this girl over mine? She's a gold digger who has poisoned your mind." He turned his fury on Alara. "You think you can walk in here with some fabricated story and take what is mine? You are nothing. Your father was a dirt digger and your mother was a servant. You come from nothing, and you will leave with nothing." It was the confession of arrogance. In his panicked rage, he had admitted everything they needed to hear. He wasn't denying the core of the story, only Alara's right to tell it. "Tell me, Marcus," Alistair said, his voice dangerously calm as he activated a small recording device on the table. "What exactly do you think is yours? The position you gained by destroying my sister's happiness? The inheritance you secured by ensuring she had no family of her own? Tell the board. Tell them how your mitigation of the Miller problem helped your career." Cornered and exposed, Marcus finally broke. "She was a fool," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "Lily was a fool too, letting her heart rule her head. I did what had to be done to protect this family, to protect our legacy from people like them." The final word hung in the air, an admission of guilt more potent than any signed document. The faces of the board members were stone. Marcus had not only confessed to a moral crime of unimaginable cruelty, but he had just demonstrated a character utterly unfit for leadership. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in a single desperate outburst. The fallout was swift and absolute. Marcus Thorne was unanimously voted out of the company and removed from the board, effective immediately. Alistair, holding Marcus's confession and the financial evidence, made it clear that he would be disinherited from the Sterling family trusts entirely. Stripped of his power, his wealth, and his name, Marcus was escorted from the building by security, a hollowed-out man, finally facing the consequences of a decades-old betrayal. Justice, delayed for 20 years, had finally been served. In the quiet aftermath, Alistair turned to Alara. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound and heavy sorrow. "I can't change what my family did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I can never repay the life that was stolen from you and your mother. But I can honor it." That day, Alistair Sterling legally recognized Alara Vance as his niece, the sole heir to Lillian Sterling's portion of the family estate. It wasn't about the money. It was an act of reclamation, of placing Alara where she rightfully belonged, in the family. He established a charitable foundation in Lily's name, dedicated to helping single mothers and families separated by hardship. The final scene is not one of grandeur, but of peace. Weeks later, Alara stands on the balcony of the penthouse, which she now understands is her home. Her mother, resting comfortably in a state-of-the-art medical suite within the apartment, is stable and for the first time in years, free from pain. Alara holds the silver locket in her hand, its surface now polished and bright. It is no longer a symbol of a lost father, but a testament to a love that endured, a truth that survived, and a family that was found. How many of us carry pieces of a story we don't fully understand? Alara's journey teaches us that integrity is a fortune that cannot be bought, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding the light. It reminds us that behind every face is a history we cannot see, and a single act of kindness or cruelty can echo for generations. If this story of justice and resilience touched your heart, please share it